Well, joining me now on Lunchtime Agenda is National Senator Matt Canavan and Labor MP Andrew Giles. Thank you both very much for joining us. I want to start with Peter Slipper. News today that his conviction and sentence has been overturned. That sentence, of course, for allegedly misusing cab charge vouchers. It's been thrown out on appeal. The judge noted it's up to MPs and ultimately the electorate to decide if they are acting within their entitlements. Matt Canavan, that seems pretty reasonable, doesn't it?
Well, look, I'm David. I'm not going to comment on what a judge thinks. That's not my job. My job is to be as good an MP that I can be and honour the position and the privilege that I have. Whatever the court decides, I do think the behaviour of Peter Slipper in those last few years, particularly some of the revelations about his communication with staff, about his use of government vehicles, were unbecoming of an MP.
Do you have sympathy for him in what he's been through?
I think Peter brought a lot of it on himself. Now, court cases are never an easy thing to go through. I'm glad, hopefully, he can get some closure because I hope he can get on with his life. But as I say, we have a very high standard that we should adhere to as people that have been picked to represent your nation, and I don't think Peter Slipper actually reached that standard. Not commenting on the court case, but the broader issue.
Andrew Giles?
Yeah, there is a very heavy onus on us to uphold the standards that people are entitled to expect from politicians, looking after our entitlements, and also the way we behave more generally in this place and how we deal with people. Again, I can't comment on the court case, that's not my job. I think all of our job is, as Matt said, to hold the office that we are privileged to hold in the esteem it should be held in.
Okay, let's get into some media issues, if you like. Foreign investment, the government looking at imposing these fees for investment in residential real estate, $5,000 under $1 million, $10,000 after that. How much solid evidence is there, Matt, that there is actually a problem in this area? I know you're probably more focused on what's happening in the bush, but we'll start with residential.
I am more focused on what happened in the bush, but it's always been strange to me there's this double standard that it's actually not, it's against the law for any foreigner to buy an established dwelling without approval. Indeed, and many approvals are knocked back. But in rural Australia, you can buy a farm without any approval, basically. Anything under $252 million until recently, actually until the 1st of March, you could buy. Now, we've actually got laws in place that we've passed as a parliament that say if you're a foreigner or a temporary resident, you need to get approval to buy an established dwelling. Now, it's clear from the evidence of the House of Reps Economics Committee that that is not very enforced at all. There are very few people in charge in Treasury of making sure that is complied with. And clearly, if we pass a law saying that you need approval before buying something, we should enforce that law, and we haven't been doing that.
Andrew, does Labor welcome this change? It is something that people who are trying to buy often talk about, a lot of anecdotal evidence that there is a problem here, but is this the solution?
Well, we don't have an in-principle difficulty with what's been outlined, but we need time to go through it. And our real concern is that this is just another example of a chaotic government making policy on the run. What seemed to be the case yesterday, and we've seen reinforcement of that today in the comments of the Treasurer when he said it would have no discernible impact, is, again, mixed signals. We see the Prime Minister and the Treasurer hop off on a VIP on a parliamentary sitting day to make an announcement. And when this is a complicated issue, when the evidence is mixed. So we're prepared.
We did know that this was coming. This has been foreshadowed for
and it's an options
a long time. Just on the actual impact of this change, there's been some suggestion it'll have a dampening effect on foreign buyers, and some in the industry suggest this may see less foreign investment in some big new residential projects, which would mean less supply, greater demand, push up prices for new residences.
David, I'm old-fashioned. I think the law should be enforced. I mean, we've got, it's a law on the books. It was relaxed in 2008 by the former Labor government, and I think some of the problems we've got right now stem from that decision. In 2008, Chris Bowen decided to make it not require temporary residents to notify purchases anymore. That caused a huge increase in the amount of foreign purchases. They backflipped on that in 2010, but I think we lost control of the enforcement of it then. and we didn't apply more resources to enforce it. So we're exploring these things. It's an options paper. Nothing will happen tomorrow in this area, will in rural land, but it's appropriate we look at, well, how can we enforce this law better, given it's from the Parliament, it's the government's jobs, executive jobs to do it.
But things have happened today already. Because of the nature of this announcement, we've seen a really extraordinary reaction in the community, in the business community, and a greater sense of uncertainty. I agree with Matt that enforcement's the issue, but why not make that the announcement and work through in a calm and considered way the policy process.
So you're saying that the signal that it sends, what could put off foreign investors?
Well, that appears to be the case.
Is that
well? If we're going to enforce a law more rigorously, we're going to have to make an announcement sometime, obviously, and we've done that yesterday. As I say, we've got a consultation process now which will run for, I think, about a month, and then we'll obviously consider what has been submitted. The concerns that people might have, they are obviously welcome to participate in this process, and the government will consider them and make a final decision.
Let's look at food labelling, and we heard from the Industry Minister just earlier in the program, Andrew Giles, a bit of extra red tape for business, potentially, but as Ian McFarlane pointed out, he reckons it'll only be 1 or 2 cents per good. It's hardly going to break the bank. It will, though, end up probably being passed on to consumers, he thinks. Is it worth it?
Well, I think it is, but the Prime Minister doesn't, and that's a really interesting thing. I think you mentioned in your interview with Ian the Prime Minister's comments on this, where he thought it was the last thing the government should be doing. So we see another extraordinary backflip, which has really characterised the government's engagement with
He
this
did
issue.
say an unreasonable cost imposed on consumers would be the last thing we'd want to do. 1 or 2 cents, is that unreasonable?
Well, let's see the proposal, but I think it is a pretty clear statement of principle that Australian consumers should firstly be entitled to understand what it is they are consuming. I think that's a pretty straightforward principle. The other thing is, when you go to the food safety issues, what they are entitled to expect from their government is a government that will be straight with them and a government that will take immediate action in a health scare like this one, and that was what did not happen.
Senator Canavan, John Hewson today suggested that there may be an element of jingoism in this. Is that...
Well, I was in China last year, David, and Chinese people are just as concerned about eating safe food as we are. Indeed, if you go to a Chinese supermarket, it's incredibly visible what comes from Australia and some other countries, because their consumers want to buy food that they know is safe, and they know that food from Australia is generally safe. So I don't think there's any jingoism here. It's a natural thing for consumers to want to know where their food is grown. It's something that I hear all the time. This is something that the Nationals Party's been calling for years, and I'm glad it's being happened. I think it's perhaps it should have been done years ago, but sometimes it takes a crisis to generate the pressure for change in politics, and when that happens, the change that usually happens is the ideas that are lying around the table, and Barnaby and the Nationals Party have had this idea lying around the table with this diagram that we could have, and I'm really glad that the government is going to move on this policy that the Nationals Party have been pushing for.
Just a quick correction, I've just double-checked, and John Hewson was actually talking about the foreign investment stuff with that comment, so apologies to all for that. But this has come out of the berries scandal. If it's about safety standards, should the money be, or should the focus be on screening to make sure that the products coming into Australia, because they're still going to keep coming into Australia, that is adequate, is making sure that...
Well, absolutely it should as well, and that's why Barnaby Joyce and Fiona Nash, and I believe Andrew Robb as well, are involved in the process of trying to make sure if our biosecurity regulations need to be strengthened. Now, it is the case after this incident that last week we've moved to screening 100% of the berries from factories that create these products.
10 days too late.
So no, that happened last week. So there is a process in place. Now, I personally think our biosecurity laws can be strengthened, or biosecurity enforcement can be strengthened. There's been a number of cases in the last few years, not just involving hepatitis. There was some soil that ended up in Canavan last year.
Prepared to pay for that?
Absolutely. It's a fundamental thing that a government should do to keep our consumers safe and our biosecurity more generally safe from diseases and impurities in products that come from offshore. And we need a process that makes sure that those risks are kept to the almost minimum, because we as a nation, this is not just about the food we eat, it's also the food we grow. because we as a nation have this high reputation for good food, and we must protect that.
Do you agree with that? Do you think we should be diverting more resources into protecting Australia from things coming in?
Well, I think there's now a firm body of evidence that suggests we need to, and one of the issues here is the relentless cuts on the public service that the government has undertaken, and we're only going to have effective screening if we've got the people, the trained people, the skilled people who can do the job. That's a very important part.
Labor also, from memory, cut particularly border areas, border protection and areas like that in the public service?
Yeah, well, if you look at the overall map of the public service, it has been dramatically decreased under this government.
Well, let's just get some stats there, David.
Thank you.
Before we came to government, the Labor government were getting rid of 12,000, just over 12,000 public servants. In the last budget, that increased it by 2,000 to 14,000, given the budget pressures. These guys did it just as much. They weren't always upfront about it because they call these things called efficiency dividends, but they're the last refuge of a scoundrel. It was about job cuts.
Okay, I want to look at Gillian Triggs. I believe that Labor will continue this point of questioning when question time gets underway in about 5 minutes' time. Matt Canavan, I know you haven't been in the chamber throughout this, but was it the right strategy, do you think, for the government to go after Gillian Triggs' reputation rather than use her report to highlight the successes that the coalition has had in actually getting children out of detention?
Well, I think there's a timing issue here. I don't believe the government has gone after her reputation as a result of this report. What actually happened was last year at Senate estimates, Professor Triggs gave evidence which was inconsistent and evasive. She originally said that she hadn't had discussions with the former Labor government and ministers in that government. It was then revealed she actually had. Now, I actually think giving evidence which is evasive and inconsistent to Senate and parliamentary committees is a very, very serious matter, particularly from a statutory office holder, which is given an enormous amount of privilege by being an independent office holder. And therefore it's extremely appropriate that the government express its displeasure when those people don't live up to the standards they're expected.
So you don't have a problem with the report itself?
Well, I've looked at the report. I haven't read all of it, but I've looked at it, and I think there is some very serious concerns about the impacts of children on detention, and that's why.
Do you think it's a partisan report, though?
I don't believe the report itself is partisan. I think its timing and its development absolutely was partisan. And I say make those comments not having read the entire report, but clearly there is an issue. We don't want kids to be in detention. It's a terrible thing for them to have to go through. But the way we stop that, both sides of politics support a policy of detention. The way we stop it is to make sure we stop illegal arrivals coming here in the first place.
Andrew Giles, what will Labor actually focus on today? You've had a couple of good goes at it over question time over the last couple of days, and a failed attempt to censure George Brandis yesterday. Where do you go from here? You've already said it to the AFP.
I think it was very interesting what Matt said a minute ago about what he thought the consequences of giving inconsistent evidence to a parliamentary committee. What we saw yesterday was ministers in the government giving inconsistent evidence, inconsistent answers about who had done what in terms of offers made on behalf of the Attorney-General to Professor Triggs. I think that's a very serious issue. And it goes to the heart of this question, which is about how our separation of powers can function, how statutory office holders can hold the government of the day, and indeed in this case, the previous government to account. I have read much of the report and it's troubling reading. It's worthy of a proper debate, and I don't think anyone who has read the report, even in part, could consider it a partisan document.
This has fed into the question of the leadership, Matt Canavan. What would your advice be to your coalition partners in the Liberal Party about Tony Abbott as leader? Would you advise them, obviously, to keep him, and where else from there?
I don't pretend to be in a position to provide advice to my Liberal colleagues. I'm in the Nationals Party. It's a matter for the Liberal Party, but I have said publicly that I don't think it's a good idea to change aeroplanes mid-air. The experience of, and I've been here while the Labor Party went through it, it's a harrowing and ongoing pain that happens by changing leaders, and I don't want that to happen in this country. It's not necessarily something about the coalition. I just don't want our nation to go down the path where we're changing prime ministers every time a poll comes out.
If there was a change, would it be a problem for the coalition agreement?
I've also said publicly, and as has the leader, Warren Truss, again, I don't pretend to speak on behalf of the Nationals Party, but we have said that our support of the coalition is never unconditional. It's conditional on getting a good deal for rural and regional Australia. So if the Liberal Party makes changes, we'll assess those to make sure that they are the best deal for rural and regional Australia.
Okay, we're out of time. Matt Canavan, Andrew Giles, thank you both very much for joining us on Lunchtime Agenda. That is all we have time for.